The rain came down like it was trying to punish the city for something. Amara Johnson ran through it anyway, her heels slapping against wet concrete, her coat plastered to her back, her phone dead in her pocket and her last $20 soaked through in her wallet. Behind her, headlights swept the alley in long yellow arcs, and a man's voice, Darnell's voice, the man she used to call her fiancé, was shouting her name like it was a threat instead of a word. Amara! Get back here! She didn't stop. She had learned a long time ago that when a man's voice changes like that, low and clipped and furious, you do not stop to ask him what's wrong. You run. So she ran, past the shuttered laundromat, past the bodega with its metal grates half down, until she saw it, a black car, engine humming, back door slightly open like an invitation from God himself. She didn't think. She didn't look at the plates. She didn't notice the tinted windows or the way the leather inside smelled like money instead of vinyl. She just threw herself into the back seat, slammed the door, and gasped, "Drive. Please. Just drive, I'll pay you, please." The car did not move. Amara froze. The privacy screen between the front and back seat was up, and in the dim glow of the street light bleeding through the window, she realized this was not a taxi. There was no meter. No little dangling air freshener. No driver hunched over a phone mount blasting talk radio. Just silence, and leather, and the faint, expensive smell of cedarwood cologne. Then the privacy screen slid down. A man turned in the front seat to look at her. He was maybe 35, black hair combed back from a sharp widow's peak, a face carved out of something colder than stone, and eyes that studied her the way a jeweler studies a diamond to find the flaw in it. He wore no expression at all. That was the most frightening part. Not anger. Not surprise. Nothing. "You are in the wrong car," he said. His voice was quiet, accented, precise, like every word had been chosen from a very short list of words he allowed himself to use. Outside, Darnell's shape appeared at the end of the alley, hands on his knees, breathing hard, scanning the street. Amara's whole body went rigid. "Please," she whispered, not to Darnell, not to God, but to the stranger in the front seat. "Please, just give me 30 seconds. Please don't make me get out right now." For a long moment, the man said nothing. His driver, a wall of a man in the seat beside him, glanced at his boss and waited, hand resting near his jacket like a habit he didn't know he had anymore. Then the man in the front seat looked past Amara, out the rear window, at Darnell stalking closer, and something in his jaw shifted. Almost invisible. A tightening. "Drive," he said to his man. Not to help her. Not out of mercy. Just one word, flat as a blade. The car pulled away from the curb, and Amara Johnson watched Darnell shrink in the rain behind her, his mouth open in a shout she couldn't hear anymore, and she did not yet understand that she had just climbed into the back seat of Kang Tae-min's car, the most feared man in 3 states, a man whose name alone made grown men empty their bank accounts and disappear overseas, and that her life, the one she had been quietly drowning in for months, had just ended the second that door closed. Behind her. If this story already has your heart racing, hit subscribe right now and turn on notifications, because what happens to Amara in the next 20 minutes will completely change how you see her, and how you see him. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from tonight. Now, let's go back. Let's understand who Amara Johnson really was before she ever got into that car. What kind of woman runs into a stranger's car in the middle of the night without even checking the license plate? What kind of man lets her stay? And what happens when the most dangerous man in the city discovers that the woman shaking in his back seat isn't running from a bad date, she's running from something that has haunted her for 3 years? Those questions matter. Hold on to them. Because nothing about this story is as simple as it looks in the first 5 minutes, and by the end, you will understand exactly why Kang Tae-min never let another person ride in that car again. 3 months earlier, Amara Johnson had been a woman with a 5-year plan. She was 29 years old, a nursing assistant at Grace Memorial Hospital on the East Side, working double shifts to save for the LPN program she'd been accepted into but couldn't yet afford. She had a studio apartment above a dry cleaner that smelled permanently of steam and starch, a mother in Georgia she called every Sunday at exactly 6 p.m., and a habit of humming old gospel songs under her breath while she changed 4 bags, not because she was especially religious, but because her grandmother used to hum them, and it made her feel less alone on the 12-hour shifts when the hospital hallways went quiet and gray. She had also, until 4 months ago, had a fiancé. Darnell Reeves had been charming in the beginning, the kind of charming that made her friends jealous and her mother cautiously hopeful. He brought her flowers on Tuesdays for no reason. He remembered the names of her coworkers. He told her, on their 6th date, that he had never met a woman who made him want to be better, and Amara, who had grown up watching her own father leave 3 different times before he left for good, had believed him, because she wanted so badly for someone to mean it. It took 18 months for the charm to curdle into something else. It started small. A comment about the shirt she wore to work being a little much for a nursing assistant. A joke, in front of his friends, about how she used to be skinnier. Then it was the checking of her phone. Then it was the counting of her tips. Then, one night in February, after she came home 40 minutes late from a shift because a patient had crashed and she'd had to stay to help stabilize him, Darnell had grabbed her by the wrist hard enough to leave 4 fingerprint-shaped bruises, and screamed into her face that she must have been somewhere else, with someone else, because no job kept a woman out that late. She left that night. She packed 2 duffel bags while he slept off the whiskey, and she moved into a friend's spare room, and she told herself, the way so many women tell themselves, that it was over now, that the worst of it was behind her. It was not behind her. Darnell did not accept endings. He called her 40 times a day until she changed her number. He waited outside the hospital until security had to walk her to her car. He sent her flowers with notes that said things like "You'll come back, you always come back," as if her leaving had simply been a phase, a tantrum, something he was patiently waiting out. And on the night it all came to a head, the night it rained like the sky itself was furious, he had followed her from a friend's birthday dinner, cornered her in a parking garage 2 blocks from that alley, and told her, in a voice she had never heard him use before, that if she wasn't going to be his, she wasn't going to be anyone's. There was one more detail Amara never told anyone, not even Priya, not even her mother on their 6 o'clock Sunday calls. The night she left Darnell's apartment for good, back in February, she had stood in the bathroom for almost 10 minutes before she could make herself pack, staring at the bruises forming on her wrist in the mirror, and she had thought, with a clarity that frightened her more than Darnell himself did, this is how it happens. This is how women end up on the news. She had grown up hearing her grandmother's stories about relatives who just disappeared, about women whose names got smaller and smaller in the family's memory until eventually no one said them at all. She had promised herself, standing in that bathroom, that she would not become one of those names. That promise was the only reason she'd had the strength to run at all, months later, through the rain, toward a car she had no reason to trust. She had also promised herself something else that night, something smaller but no less important, that she would never again mistake a man's intensity for love. Darnell had been intense from the very beginning, intensely attentive, intensely jealous, intensely everything, and for a long time she had let herself believe that intensity was simply what devotion looked like. It had taken 18 months of slowly shrinking herself to understand that devotion and control could wear the exact same face, and that the only real way to tell them apart was to watch what happened when you tried to leave. That was the moment Amara ran. That was the moment that put her, breathless and soaked and terrified, into the back seat of a car that did not belong to a stranger who would help her. It belonged to a man the city didn't dare say the wrong things about out loud. Kang Tae-min did not, as a rule, notice women. He noticed threats. He noticed weakness in his lieutenants before they knew it themselves. He noticed the half-second delay in a man's eyes when that man was about to lie to him. 12 years ago, at 23, he had taken control of an organization his father had built from nothing but blood and patience, an organization that moved money and secrets and sometimes worse across 3 states, and in those 12 years he had trained every soft part of himself into something that could not be exploited. He had watched his own father die slow and humiliated because he had trusted the wrong woman with the wrong piece of information, and Tae-min had promised himself, over that hospital bed, that he would never make his father's mistake. So when a stranger threw herself into the back of his car on a rain-soaked Tuesday night, his first instinct was not curiosity. It was calculation. Who sent her? What she wanted? Whether this was an elaborate setup by one of the 3 rival families currently circling his territory like sharks smelling blood in the water. But then he had looked at her, really looked, and calculation had stumbled, just slightly, against something else. She was shaking so hard the seat creaked. Her mascara had run in long gray lines down a face that was trying, with everything it had, not to cry in front of a stranger. Her eyes, when they finally lifted to his, held no calculation at all. Only terror, raw and unrehearsed, the kind you cannot fake even if you tried. He knew fear intimately. He had built an empire on other men's fear. But he had rarely seen it worn like this, not fear of him, but fear of something behind her, something she had been running from long before she ever touched the handle of his door. Kang Tae-min had not always been a man who inspired that kind of fear. There had been a version of him once, a version that existed only in the memory of a handful of people still living, who had been a quiet, serious boy raised in the back rooms of his father's restaurants, doing homework at a corner table while men in dark coats came and went through a door he was told never to ask about. His father had wanted something different for him, had said so, more than once, in the rare unguarded moments between them, a university degree, a legitimate business, a life spent far from the world that had already begun, quietly and without his son's permission, to claim him. That future had ended the year Tae-min turned 23, when his father was betrayed by a woman he had trusted with the location of a shipment worth more than most men would see in 10 lifetimes. She had not been an enemy. She had been someone his father loved, someone who had, under pressure Tae-min never fully learned the shape of, given up the information that got his father shot 3 times in a warehouse very much like the one Tae-min would one day drag Amara out of. He had lived 4 days in a hospital bed before he died, long enough for Tae-min to sit beside him every one of those days, watching a man who had once seemed unbreakable diminish, hour by hour, into something small and gray and silent. His father's last coherent words to him had not been about love, or forgiveness, or any of the things a dying man is supposed to say. They had been a warning. Do not let anyone close enough to be used against you. Tae-min had taken that warning and built his entire adult life around it, brick by brick, until the organization he inherited had become not merely profitable but nearly untouchable, because a man with no soft places has no soft places for his enemies to strike. For 12 years, it had worked exactly as intended. He had women, when he wanted them, who understood precisely what was and was not being offered. He had allies who respected him and rivals who feared him and employees who would have walked into fire on his word alone, and none of them, not a single one, knew anything about him that could be turned into a weapon. He had believed, with the same total certainty he applied to every calculation, that this was simply the cost of survival in his world, and that he had made his peace with paying it. He had not accounted for a woman throwing herself into the back of his car on a rain-swept Tuesday, mascara running, apologizing 11 times in 90 seconds, looking at him with a fear that had nothing to do with him at all, and, underneath that fear, a stubborn, exhausted dignity that refused to disappear even when everything else about her seemed to be falling apart. He recognized something in her that he rarely allowed himself to recognize in anyone, the specific look of a person who has been quietly, systematically diminished by someone who was supposed to love them, and who has decided, against every rational incentive to simply give up, to survive anyway. It should not have mattered to him. He told himself, for the first several blocks, that it did not matter to him. By the time they passed Darnell standing helpless and furious on the wet street corner, he had already, without quite admitting it to himself, decided that it did. "Where do you need to go?" he said, once the car had put 6 blocks between them and the alley. It was not offered kindly. It was offered the way a transaction is offered, quick, clean, get it over with. Amara wiped at her face with the back of her hand, smearing the mascara worse. "Anywhere," she said. I don't care. Just not back there. That is not an address." "I don't have one right now," she said, and her voice cracked in the middle, and she hated herself for it, hated that a stranger in an expensive suit was watching her fall apart in real time. "I'm sorry. I'll get out at the next light. I didn't mean to. I just needed 30 seconds and I got them. Thank you. I'm sorry." She reached for the door handle. It didn't move. Child-locked, she realized, and her stomach dropped through the floor of the car. "I said get out at the next light," Taemin said to his driver, not to her, and something about the flatness of his voice, the total absence of threat in it, made Amara's panic recalibrate slightly. He wasn't holding her. He was releasing her. The door clicked open the moment the car slowed at the corner of 9th and Mercer. But Amara did not move. Because out the front windshield, 3 blocks up, illuminated by the wash of a street lamp, stood Darnell. He had run around, cut through the alley behind the garage, and was standing exactly where the car was about to stop, scanning the street with the particular stillness of a man who has decided he is done being patient. Taemin watched her freeze. Watched the direction of her gaze. Followed it, and found, without needing to be told, the shape of the man who had put that fear in her in the first place. For a second, nobody in the car said anything. Then Taemin said, quietly, almost to himself, "That is the man." It was not a question. Amara didn't answer. She didn't have to. Her whole body had answered for her, shrinking into the seat, arms crossed over her stomach like she was trying to make herself smaller than the world could reach. Taemin looked at her for one more long second. Then he reached forward and tapped the privacy screen switch, and it rose back up between the front seat and the back, sealing her inside with him, sealing the world outside. "Drive past him," he told his man. Slowly. "Comment right now and tell me, would you have stayed in that car? Like this video if your heart is already racing for Amara, because what's coming next is the part nobody expects." The car crawled past Darnell at a speed just slow enough to be deliberate, and through the tinted glass, Amara watched him turn his head, watched his eyes rake over the vehicle with the paranoid hunger of a man who suspects, but cannot prove, that the woman he lost is somewhere inside it. He didn't recognize the car. He couldn't. There was no reason a man like Darnell would ever have cause to recognize the black sedan belonging to Kang Taemin, because men like Darnell existed in a world several floors below the one Taemin occupied, a world of small cruelties and petty control, while Taemin's world was built on things far larger and far darker than one woman's broken engagement. But Amara didn't know any of that yet. All she knew was that she was sitting 3 feet from a man who had just, with a single quiet command, made the most terrifying person in her life shrink to the size of an ant on a rainy street corner, and something about that, something about watching Darnell search and fail to find her, cracked something loose in her chest that she'd been holding shut for months. She started crying. Not the careful, contained crying she'd trained herself to do in hospital supply closets so her coworkers wouldn't ask questions. Ugly crying. Shoulder shaking, breath hitching, 3 months of swallowed terror crying. Taemin did not reach for her. He did not offer a tissue, or a platitude, or any of the small comforting gestures other men might have performed for an audience of one. He simply sat, very still, and let her cry, the way you let a storm finish itself out because trying to stop it halfway only makes it worse. When she finally quieted, hiccuping, wiping her face with her sleeve, she found him watching her with an expression she couldn't read. "I'm sorry," she said again, for what felt like the 100th time that night. I don't even know your name. You don't owe me anything. I'll get out, I really will, I just..." "Kang Taemin," he said. She blinked. "What?" "My name," he said, as if it were self-evident that this was the information she needed. "You said you do not know it. Now you do." It was such a strange thing to say, so oddly formal, so entirely beside the point of everything happening, that Amara let out a small, wet laugh despite herself. "Amara," she managed. "Amara Johnson." He nodded once, filing it away the way he filed away everything, permanently and without effort. "Amara Johnson," he repeated, testing the shape of her name the way you test the weight of an unfamiliar object. "You have nowhere to go tonight." It wasn't a question, but she answered it anyway, Because there was no version of tonight where lying to this man seemed like a survivable strategy. "No," she admitted. "I was staying with a friend, but Darnell, he knows the address now. I can't go back there. I can't put her in danger too." Taemin was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the rain had started to slow, thinning into a mist that blurred the streetlights into halos. "There is a hotel," he said finally. "The Ashford, on 14th. It is owned by an associate of mine. You will stay there tonight. It will be paid for. No one will find you." Amara stared at him. "Why would you do that?" For the first time since she'd climbed into his car, something almost like discomfort crossed Taemin's face, the look of a man being asked to explain an instinct he had not examined and did not particularly want to. "I do not know," he said, and it seemed to surprise him as much as it surprised her. "I am not in the business of helping strangers." "Then why?" He looked out the window, at the wet streets sliding by, at the city he owned in ways she couldn't yet imagine. "Because the way that man looked at you," he said slowly, "I have seen that look before. On men who do not stop. And I find that I do not want to know what happens if you are not somewhere safe tonight." It should have terrified her more, hearing a stranger speak so plainly about danger, about men who don't stop, as if he had personal, intimate knowledge of exactly what such men were capable of. But instead, oddly, it steadied her. Here was a man who was not pretending the danger wasn't real. Who wasn't going to tell her she was overreacting, or that Darnell probably didn't mean it, or any of the soft lies people offered women like her to make their own discomfort go away. "Okay," she whispered. "Thank you." Taemin didn't respond to the gratitude. He simply reached into his jacket, retrieved a plain black card with nothing on it but a phone number, and held it out to her. "If he finds you," he said, "before you find somewhere permanent, call this number. Someone will answer." Amara took the card with trembling fingers, and neither of them could have known, in that moment, how many times she would end up dialing it before the year was over, or how completely her life, and his, were about to become entangled in ways neither of them could survive walking away from clean. If you're new here, welcome, hit that subscribe button now, because this story only gets more intense from here, and you do not want to miss what happens when Darnell finds out exactly whose car Mara disappeared into. The Ashford turned out to be nothing like the seedy, mattress-on-the-floor hideout Amara had braced herself for. It was quiet, elegant, the kind of place where the woman at the front desk didn't ask questions, just handed over a key card and said, "Mr. Kang's guest, room 412, everything's arranged," as though this happened every day. As though women fleeing their fiancés were regularly delivered to this lobby by the most feared man in 3 states. Amara didn't sleep that first night. She lay on top of the covers in her damp clothes, staring at the ceiling, replaying the alley, the car, the flat certainty in Taemin's voice when he said drive past him, slowly, like it was nothing, like rerouting fear itself was just another Tuesday for him. She thought about calling her mother, and decided against it. Her mother worried enough already. And Amara wasn't ready to explain how she'd ended up sleeping in a hotel paid for by a man whose name she'd learned only hours before. She thought about the card in her coat pocket. A black rectangle with 10 digits on it, no name, no logo, nothing to indicate it belonged to anyone at all, and yet she had the strangest, most illogical certainty that if she called that number at 3 in the morning, someone would actually pick up. She didn't test it that night. She wouldn't need to for another 11 days. Darnell did not disappear quietly. Men like him rarely did. He showed up outside the hospital again on a Thursday, leaning against a pillar in the staff parking lot like he had every right to be there, and when Amara's coworker Priya tried to intervene, he'd smiled at her, a smile with no warmth in it at all, and said, "This doesn't concern you, sweetheart," in a tone that made even Priya, who was not easily rattled, take a step back. Amara called the number that night. She hadn't planned to. She'd told herself she would handle it herself, file a police report, get a restraining order, do all the things the pamphlets told women in her situation to do, pamphlets that assumed the system would move fast enough, care enough, before something irreversible happened. But standing in the parking lot with her hands shaking too hard to get her key in the ignition, She'd pulled out the black card instead and dialed. It rang twice. Yes. Taemin's voice, unmistakable, flat and immediate, like he'd been waiting for the call rather than surprised by it. He was outside my work, Amara said, and hated how small her voice sounded. I'm sorry, I know this isn't your problem, I didn't know who else. Where are you now? Still in the parking lot. I don't think he's still here, but Do not drive yourself home. Not a suggestion. An instruction, delivered with the same total confidence he seemed to apply to everything. Someone is 5 minutes away. You don't have to. Amara. It was the first time he'd said her name, and something about the way he said it, precise, deliberate, like it mattered to him to get it exactly right, made her stop arguing. Do not drive yourself home. 5 minutes later, a black SUV pulled into the lot, and the same wall of a man who'd been driving that first night stepped out, nodded to her once, and said, Mr. Kong asked me to follow you home. Just to be sure. That was how it started. Not with romance. Not with grand declarations. With a man whose empire ran on fear and control, quietly, methodically, making sure one woman got home safely, night after night, without ever once asking her for anything in return. It took 3 weeks for Amara to understand what Kang Taemin actually was. She'd known, in some vague way, that he was dangerous, the way you know a river is deep without ever having measured it. But knowing and understanding are different animals, and understanding arrived the night she was waiting in the lobby of the building where he sometimes had her meet him for the careful, guarded dinners that had slowly, without either of them quite naming it, become a fixture of her week. She'd arrived early. The elevator doors had opened on the wrong floor, and she'd stepped out into a room full of men in dark suits, and Taemin at the head of a long table, speaking in a voice she had never heard him use with her, cold, final, absolute, to a man on his knees who was weeping and begging in a language Amara didn't understand but didn't need to, because fear translates itself perfectly across every border. She had not been meant to see that. The doors closed again almost instantly, someone's hand slamming the button, and she rode back down to the lobby in silence, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her teeth. When Taemin found her 20 minutes later, pale and still standing exactly where the elevator had left her, he did not apologize. He did not pretend it hadn't happened. Now you know, he said simply. What was that? Who was that man? Someone who stole from me. Someone who will not do it again. He studied her face, watching for the fear he assumed was coming, the recoil, the retreat. You should leave, he said, almost gently, for him. This is not a world for someone like you. But Amara, who had spent 3 months learning exactly what quiet, ordinary-looking men were capable of behind closed doors, who had bruises that had only recently finished fading from a man with no criminal empire at all, just a bad temper and a marriage license he thought entitled him to her body, found that the fear she expected to feel simply didn't arrive the way it should have. He was stealing from you, she said slowly. Was he going to hurt people with what he stole? Taemin's jaw tightened. Yes. Then I'm not going to pretend I understand your world, Amara said, surprising herself with her own steadiness. But I've spent 3 months being afraid of a man who never once had to answer to anyone for what he did to me. Maybe I don't get to judge what fear looks like on people who deserve it. It was not the response he'd expected. He had spent 12 years surrounded by people who feared him, respected him, obeyed him, but almost no one who looked at the worst part of his world and simply, calmly, refused to run. That night was the first time Kang Taemin let himself wonder if this woman was going to become a problem he could not solve with money, or violence, or careful distance. He was right to wonder. He simply didn't yet understand how large a problem she would become, or how much he would eventually want her to stay exactly that dangerous to him. If this is the part where you started rooting for them, comment I see it below, because what's about to happen next is the moment everything changes, for both of them. The weeks that followed built something neither of them had a name for. It wasn't dating, not in any conventional sense. Taemin did not take her to movies or hold her hand in public, because a man in his position could not afford to be seen attaching himself to anyone the way ordinary men attached themselves to the women they loved. But there were dinners in private rooms of restaurants Amara had only ever read about, where he asked her, with genuine curiosity, about the patients she cared for, about the particular tenderness required to hold a stranger's hand while they died, about why she still hummed her grandmother's hymns even though she said she wasn't sure what she believed anymore. There were nights he sent his driver simply to make sure she got home, long after Darnell had, for the moment, gone quiet. There was the night she found him standing on the balcony of his penthouse at 2 in the morning, unable to sleep, and instead of leaving him to his silence, she'd sat beside him and asked what kept him awake, and he'd told her, haltingly, in fragments, like a man and used to the shape of his own honesty, about his father, about the hospital bed, about the promise he'd made to never let anyone close enough to be used against him. And yet, Amara had said quietly, "Here I am." "Here you are," he'd agreed, and something in his voice sounded less like regret than like a man watching a carefully built wall crack, unable to decide if he wanted to repair it or let it fall. It was reckless. Both of them knew it. A man like Taemin did not fall for a nursing assistant with an abusive ex-fiancé and no understanding of the world he moved through. A woman like Amara did not fall for a man whose hands, however gently they might one day touch her face, had also signed the fates of men she'd glimpsed once, weeping, on their knees. But recklessness has never once stopped anything worth having, and by the time autumn turned the city's trees the color of rust, Amara Johnson understood, with the same total certainty with which she'd once understood Darnell's love was a trap, that whatever she felt for Kang Taemin was not something she could talk herself out of. She just didn't yet know how badly that certainty was about to be tested. Darnell found out about Taemin on a Tuesday in October, not through any carelessness on Amara's part, but because a man like Darnell, humiliated and obsessive, had spent months quietly asking questions, following whispers, until one of Amara's old co-workers, meaning no harm, mentioned in passing that Amara had some rich guy looking out for her now. It was enough. Darnell did not need a name. He only needed to know that another man existed, and that was enough to detonate whatever fragile restraint he'd been operating under. He showed up at her apartment, her new apartment, the one she thought Taemin's people had kept secret, at 11 at night, banging on the door hard enough to rattle the frame, screaming things through the wood that made her neighbors call the police before Amara even had the presence of mind to reach for her phone. By the time the police arrived, Darnell was gone. But he left something behind, a note, shoved under her door, for words scrawled in handwriting she recognized instantly, because she had once thought that handwriting was proof of how much he loved her. "You'll regret this. Both of you." Amara called Taemin with shaking hands. He arrived in 11 minutes, which she would later learn was the fastest he had ever crossed the city for anything in his life, and when he saw the note, saw her sitting on the floor with her back against the wall, saw the splintered wood where Darnell had kicked at her door, something in his face went very, very still, the specific stillness of a man deciding, in real time, exactly how far he was willing to go. "He knows about me," he said. "I'm sorry," Amara whispered. "I never told him. I don't know how he—" "This is not your fault." He crouched in front of her, and for the first time since the night in the alley, he reached out and took her face gently between his hands, forcing her to look at him instead of at the broken door behind her. "Listen to me. This ends now. Tonight. Do you understand? What are you going to do?" He didn't answer right away. And in his silence, Amara understood, with a clarity that terrified her, that she was about to watch the man she loved become exactly as dangerous as the reputation that preceded him, and that some small, exhausted, furious part of her wasn't sure she wanted to stop him. Comment protect her if you're holding your breath right now, because the next part of this story is the most intense turn yet, and I promise you did not see it coming. Kang Taemin did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Within an hour, he had assembled 3 of his most trusted men in the living room of Amara's apartment, and the instructions he gave them were delivered in the same flat, precise tone he used for everything, as though he were discussing shipment logistics instead of a man's fate. "Find him," he said. "Do not touch him yet. I want to know everything, his finances, his family, who he owes money to, who is afraid of him, who would not miss him if he disappeared tomorrow. I want to understand this man completely before I decide what happens to him." Amara, listening from the doorway of her bedroom, felt something cold slide down her spine. "Taemin," she said. "What does that mean? What happens to him?" He turned to look at her, and for a moment the mask he wore for his men slipped, just slightly, revealing something rawer underneath, not the calm control she'd grown used to, but something closer to fury, banked and controlled but unmistakably present. "It means," he said quietly, "that no one threatens what is mine and continues to exist in the same city as it." "I'm not a possession," Amara said, her own voice sharpening despite the fear still humming in her chest. "And I don't want you to become a murderer over me." The word landed hard in the room. His men shifted, uncomfortable, and used to hearing anyone speak to their boss this way. But Taemin held her gaze, and something in his expression cracked further, not anger at her defiance, but something closer to grief. "I have already been many things you would not want me to be," he said, low enough that it was almost just for her. "I cannot undo that. But I can decide, right now, whether the worst thing I have ever done is protect you, or lose you. There's a difference between protecting me and becoming a monster to do it." "Is there?" he said, and it wasn't really a question. "You have not seen what men like Darnell become when they are only frightened instead of stopped. Fear did not save you from him for 3 years. It only delayed him." Amara didn't have an answer for that, because some cold, honest part of her knew he was right, knew that restraining orders and police reports and changed locks had done nothing to slow Darnell down, that only the threat of Taemin's world had ever actually made him hesitate. It was a truth she hated. It didn't make it less true. "Please," she said finally, quietly. "Don't kill him. I don't want that on you. I don't want it on us." Taemin studied her for a long moment, weighing something she couldn't see. Then he nodded, once, and turned back to his men. "No violence," he said. "Yet. I want him ruined instead. His job. His accounts. Every door in this city closed to him, so completely that he understands, without needing to be told twice, that pursuing her again will cost him everything he has left to lose." It was, Amara would understand later, the closest thing to mercy that Kang Taemin knew how to offer, and it was, in its own quiet way, more frightening than violence would have been, because it revealed the sheer scale of what he was capable of when he simply decided to end someone's life without ever laying a hand on them. It took 6 days. Amara didn't ask for details, and Taemin didn't offer them, but she watched it happen in fragments, a call from Priya saying Darnell had been fired from his job at the logistics company, escorted out by security after some discrepancy in the accounts was discovered, a mutual acquaintance mentioning that his apartment building had suddenly, inexplicably, terminated his lease, a message from her mother, who'd heard through the grapevine back in Georgia that Darnell's new business venture, the one he'd been bragging about for months, had collapsed overnight when every investor pulled out on the same day. By the 7th day, Darnell showed up outside Amara's building one final time, not aggressive now, but hollowed out, desperate, a man watching his entire life dissolve and unable to understand why. "What did you do?" he said, when Taemin stepped out of the building to meet him, flanked by 2 of his men. "What did you do to my life?" "I removed you from it," Taemin said simply. "As you tried to remove her from hers." "This isn't over," Darnell said, though the words came out shaking, empty, a man saying lines from a script he no longer believed in. "It is," Taemin said. "You may leave this city, or you may stay and watch how much smaller I can still make your world. Those are the only 2 options remaining to you." Darnell left 3 days later. Amara never saw him again. For a while, Amara let herself believe that the hardest part was over. She went back to her shifts at Grace Memorial with a lightness she hadn't felt in years, humming louder than usual, letting Priya tease her about the mystery man who sometimes waited in a black SUV at the end of her shift without ever coming inside. She started the LPN program that spring, paid for quietly, without discussion, by a man who simply transferred the tuition one afternoon and told her, when she tried to argue, that it was not a gift, it was an investment, and that he did not make investments in things he did not believe in. But peace, she was learning, was not something Taemin's world dispensed generously. It only ever loaned it, briefly, before collecting the debt. The first sign of trouble came in small, deniable pieces, the kind of thing you could almost convince yourself you'd imagined. A car that idled too long outside her building. A man at the hospital cafeteria who asked too many casual questions about her schedule, then vanished before security could be called. A bouquet of white lilies delivered to her apartment with no card, no name, nothing but the unmistakable message that someone knew exactly where she lived and wanted her to know it. She told Taemin about the lilies over dinner, trying to keep her voice light, and watched the ease drain out of his face in real time. White lilies, he repeated slowly. Does that mean something? It is a warning, he said. In my world, flowers are rarely only flowers. He was quiet for a long moment, turning his glass slowly on the table, and when he spoke again his voice had gone careful in a way she had learned to recognize as him working very hard not to frighten her. There are men in my organization who believe I have become weak. That loving someone outside these walls makes me vulnerable to being used. They are not entirely wrong to believe it. It is simply that they intend to prove it by hurting you instead of me. Amara set down her fork. How long have you known? Weeks, he admitted. I hoped to resolve it before you had to carry the weight of knowing. You don't get to protect me by keeping me in the dark, Amara said, and something in her voice surprised even herself, steadier now, less afraid of conflict than the woman who had once apologized 11 times in the back of his car for the crime of existing in it. I spent 3 years with a man who thought love meant deciding what I was allowed to know for my own good. I won't do that again. Not even with you. Taemin studied her for a long moment, something complicated moving behind his eyes, pride, maybe, tangled up with fear he would never admit to out loud. You are right, he said finally. I am sorry. I will not do it again. He told her everything that night. About Sue, his father's cousin by marriage, a man who had served the organization for 20 years and believed, with the quiet, patient certainty of someone who has been underestimated for exactly as long, that Taemin's heart had become a door left unlocked. About the whispers moving through the lower ranks, not open rebellion yet, nothing so clumsy, but the slow, deliberate testing of loyalties that always preceded a real move for power. About how the lilies, the idling car, the man in the cafeteria, were not random cruelties but a message aimed specifically at Taemin. We know what you love, and we are not afraid to touch it. What do we do? Amara asked. We, Taemin said, and something in the way he repeated the word, like it still surprised him to use it, to mean it, made her chest ache. You will let me handle Sue the way I handle every threat to what is mine. And you will not go anywhere alone until this is finished. Not the hospital. Not the grocery store on the corner. Nowhere. I can't put my whole life on hold. Your whole life, he said quietly, is exactly what is at stake. She hated how much she understood that he was right. In the weeks that followed, a version of house arrest settled over her days, a driver waiting outside every shift, a second set of eyes she never saw but always felt, escorting her from the moment she stepped outside her building to the moment she stepped back inside it. She chafed against it, some nights, missing the ordinary freedom of walking 3 blocks to the corner store without an audience. But she had also, by then, learned enough about the cost of the alternative to swallow her complaints most days and simply endure it. It was during those weeks of careful, suffocating protection that Amara began to understand something else, too, something Taemin had never said outright but that revealed itself in the smallest of gestures. The way he called every night at exactly 9, not to check on her location, but simply to hear her describe her day, the vitals she'd taken, the elderly patient in room 214 who told her the same story about his late wife every single shift and how Amara let him tell it anyway, every time, like it was the first. The way he had, without her ever asking, arranged for a locksmith to reinforce every door in her apartment building, not just her own, because, he told her, almost embarrassed by his own thoroughness, if they cannot reach you directly, they may try your neighbors, and I will not have anyone hurt because they happen to live near you. This was not the man the city whispered about in fearful, clipped sentences. Or rather, it was exactly that man, the same cold calculation, the same total command of every variable, simply turned in a direction no one had ever seen him turn it before, toward keeping one ordinary woman safe, at any cost, without complaint, without ever once making her feel like a burden for needing it. It was, Amara thought some nights, lying awake in an apartment with reinforced locks and a driver parked outside like a silent guardian, the strangest kind of love story she could have imagined for herself. And yet, increasingly, she could not imagine any other kind that would have fit her half so well. If you've made it this far, drop a like right now. This next part is the emotional turning point of the entire story, and it changes everything you think you know about both of them. You would think that would be the end of it, the villain vanquished, the danger dissolved, the couple free to fall the rest of the way into each other without obstruction. But love built inside a world like Taemin's does not get to end simply because the immediate threat is gone. It only reveals the next one. The next one came in the shape of Taemin's own organization. There were men, older men, men who had served his father before him, men who had watched Taemin build his cold reputation with something like pride, who did not understand why their boss had, over the course of a single year, become soft enough to risk everything for a nursing assistant with no money, no power, no usefulness to the family beyond the fact that he loved her. Chief among them was a man named Soo, Taemin's own uncle by marriage, who had quietly begun testing the loyalty of the organization's lieutenants, whispering that a leader distracted by love was a leader who could be replaced. Amara learned about the threat the way she learned about most things in Taemin's world, too late, and from the wrong person. She was leaving the hospital on a Friday evening when a woman she didn't recognize approached her in the parking lot, calm and polished and utterly without menace, and said, "You should know that loving him is going to get you killed. Not by him. By the people who think he shouldn't love anyone at all." The woman was gone before Amara could ask her name. She told Taemin that night, and watched something shift behind his eyes, not surprise, she realized. He had known this was coming. He had simply hoped to solve it before she ever had to. "Sue," he said quietly, once she described the woman. "That would be one of his people. What does he want? Me, weakened? Or gone?" Taemin's hands, usually so controlled, curled slowly into fists on the table between them. He believes that a man who loves someone can be manipulated through her. He is not wrong. That is exactly the danger you represent to me, and exactly why I should have ended this the night you got into my car. Do you regret it? Amara asked, and hated how small her voice sounded, hated that after everything, some old fear still lived in her, waiting for a man to tell her she was too much trouble to keep. But Taemin reached across the table and took her hand, a small gesture, ordinary in any other context, monumental in his, and said, with a certainty that steadied something in her chest that had been shaking since the night in the alley, "No. I regret only that loving you has made you a target. I do not regret loving you. I never will." It came to a head 3 weeks later, in a warehouse on the edge of the Harbor District, in a confrontation Amara was never meant to witness but arrived at anyway, having received a message from an unknown number that said simply, "Come alone, or he dies tonight." She should have called for help. She would tell herself that, later, 100 times, lying awake replaying the decision. But in the moment, faced with the possibility that Taemin, the man who had pulled her out of a rainstorm and quietly, patiently, without ever once demanding anything from her, taught her what it felt like to be protected instead of controlled, might die because of a war she had unknowingly started simply by existing, she did not think. She drove. The warehouse was cavernous, half-lit, smelling of salt and rust. Taemin was on his knees in the center of the floor, hands bound, a thin line of blood at his temple, and Sue stood over him with the particular satisfaction of a man who believes he has already won. "Ah," Sue said, when Amara stepped through the door, flanked by no one, protected by nothing. "The famous Amara Johnson. You know, I almost admire you. It has been 12 years since anyone made Kang Taemin this careless." "Let him go," Amara said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I intend to," Sue said pleasantly. "Once you have signed something for me." He gestured, and one of his men brought forward a folded document, a formal declaration. Amara would learn that Taemin was unfit to lead, that she, as his weakness, was voluntarily removing herself in exchange for his life, effectively handing control of the organization to Sue without a single shot fired. "Don't," Taemin said from the floor, the first word he'd spoken since she arrived, his voice raw but his eyes fixed on hers with an intensity that made her chest ache. "Amara. Do not sign that. Whatever happens to me, do not sign that." "I'm not going to let you die," Amara said. "I would rather die," Taemin said, "than watch you become the reason I lost everything I built to protect the people who depend on me. Do not sign it." Sue laughed, low and unbothered. "How romantic." "Unfortunately, my dear, his opinion is not the one that matters right now." Amara looked at the document. She looked at Taemin, bloodied and bound and still, impossibly, trying to protect her even from himself. And she thought about every moment of the last year, the black card in her coat pocket, the driver who'd followed her home night after night without ever being thanked properly, the balcony at 2 in the morning where a man who feared nothing had told her, haltingly, about the one thing he had promised himself he'd never risk again. She picked up the pen. And then, in the same motion, she threw it, not at the document, but at the single overhead light directly above Sue's head, shattering the bulb, plunging half the warehouse into sudden, disorienting darkness, exactly as Taemin's men, who had been quietly closing in through the loading doors for the last 4 minutes while Sue gloated, finally made their move. It was over in less than a minute. Amara would remember it only in fragments afterward, shouting, the scrape of a chair, Taemin's voice cutting through the chaos calling her name, and then his arms around her, real and warm and shaking almost as badly as her own, in a warehouse gone suddenly, completely silent. "You were supposed to run," he said into her hair, furious and relieved in equal measure. "You were supposed to call for help and run." "I know," Amara said. "I'm not very good at running from the things I love anymore." If this is the moment you fell in love with this story, comment "I felt that" right now and make sure you're subscribed, because we are almost at the ending, and it is worth every second of the wait. Sue did not survive the night, though Amara never asked for details, and Taemin never offered them, and in the strange calculus of the world she had chosen to stay in, she understood that some silences were kindnesses. What she did ask, weeks later, sitting on the same balcony where he had once confessed the shape of his father's death, was whether he still believed love was the mistake he'd promised himself he'd never make again. Taemin considered the question for a long time, the city spread out gold and glittering below them, before he answered. "My father died," he said, "because he trusted the wrong person with the truth of who he was. I spent 12 years believing that meant I could never let anyone see the truth of who I am." He turned to look at her, and something in his face was softer than she had ever seen it, softer than she suspected anyone alive had ever seen it. "But you have seen exactly who I am. The worst of it. And you stayed. I do not think that is the mistake I feared. I think it is the only thing I have ever gotten right." Amara Johnson had climbed into a stranger's car on the worst night of her life, running from a man who mistook control for love, and she had found, instead, a man who understood that real protection asks nothing in return but the truth. It was not the fairy tale anyone would have predicted for her, not the safe, ordinary happiness she had once planned for herself in a 5-year plan that never accounted for warehouses or warlords or a card with 10 unmarked digits, but it was hers, chosen freely, walked into with open eyes, and in the end, that made it more hers than any life she could have designed in advance. She still hums her grandmother's hymns sometimes, late at night, when the city outside the window has finally gone quiet. Taemin has learned all of them by heart, though he will never admit he knows the words. If Amara and Taemin's story moved you tonight, make sure you're subscribed and hit that notification bell, because there are so many more stories like this one waiting for you. Drop a comment below and tell me what part hit you the hardest. I read every single one. And if you love this, share it with someone who needs a story like this tonight. Thank you for staying until the very end. See you in the next one.